Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the exploration vessel Aurora and watched the alien ships approach through the darkness of space. The crystalline vessels moved with a grace that seemed impossible for something so large. Their hulls pulsed with soft blue and green lights that created patterns across their surface like living art. Jake had seen many strange things during his 15 years exploring the Outer Rim, but nothing quite like this. The first contact protocols demanded caution, but Jake felt oddly calm as the alien ships drew closer. There was something peaceful about the way they moved without any aggressive posturing or weapon displays. His communications officer, Lieutenant Dan Cooper, looked up from his console with excitement clear on his young face. The aliens were broadcasting on multiple frequencies, and their message was simple. They wanted to talk. Ambassador Lisa Carter had arrived on the Aurora just 3 days before the alien contact. She was Earth's most experienced diplomat and had handled first contact situations with the few other species humanity had encountered in their expansion across the galaxy. Most of those meetings had been brief and formal affairs with species that preferred to keep to themselves. This felt different from the moment the crystalline ships appeared on their sensors. The alien flagship was beautiful in a way that took Jake's breath away. It looked more grown than built, with smooth curves and organic shapes that reminded him of deep-sea creatures from Earth's oceans. When the docking tube connected and the airlock opened, Jake felt his heart race with anticipation. This was the moment that would change everything for humanity. The beings that came aboard called themselves Zephyrians, and they were unlike anything in human records. They stood nearly 8 feet tall with bodies that seemed to be made of living crystal. Light moved through their transparent skin in slow waves, and their faces held expressions of genuine warmth and welcome. Their leader introduced himself as harmony singer Valtar and spoke perfect English with a voice like wind chimes. Lisa Carter took the lead in the first meeting, while Jake and his senior staff observed from the sides of the conference room. Zephyrian spoke of peace and unity with words that seemed to carry extra weight and meaning. They described a vast confederation of species that had joined together to end war and suffering across their region of the galaxy. They called it the Collective and painted it as a paradise where all beings lived in harmony. Veltar explained that they had been watching humanity for some time and were impressed by human creativity and potential. He said the Collective wanted to welcome humanity as equals and share their advanced technology. The promises he made were incredible. Extended lifespans that could stretch for thousands of years. Technology that could end hunger and disease. Energy sources that would power human civilization for eternity. Peace that would last forever. The meeting lasted for hours as the Zephyrians answered every question with patience and detail. They showed holographic displays of collective worlds where different species worked together in what looked like perfect harmony. Cities that floated in the clouds. Underwater colonies that stretched for miles. Space stations that housed billions of beings in comfort and safety. It all looked too good to be true. Jake noticed that Commander Rick Hansen remained quiet throughout the presentation. Rick was the Aurora's intelligence officer and had a reputation for seeing through deception that made him valuable on exploration missions. His expression stayed neutral, but Jake could see the concern in his eyes as the Zephyrians continued their pitch for humanity to join their collective. When the formal meeting ended, the Zephyrians invited Lisa and a small team to visit their flagship for a tour. Jake wanted to go, but diplomatic protocol required him to stay with his ship. Rick volunteered to accompany the ambassador, along with Dr. Amanda Walsh, who served as the Aurora's xenobiologist. Amanda was excited about the chance to study alien life up close and had been taking detailed notes throughout the meeting. The tour group returned 6 hours later with expressions that ranged from amazement to confusion. Lisa spoke privately with Jake in his ready room, while Rick disappeared to compile his intelligence report. Amanda headed straight to her lab to analyze the biological samples the Zephyrians had given her permission to collect. Everyone seemed to have different impressions of what they had seen. Lisa was clearly impressed by the technology and organization of the collective ship. She described medical facilities that could cure any disease and engineering systems that seemed to run themselves. The crew members she met from different species all seemed happy and content with their lives. They spoke of the peace and security they enjoyed as part of the collective. Rick's report painted a different picture. He had used his training to observe things that others might miss, and what he saw troubled him. The alien crew members all moved and spoke in similar patterns, as if they were following some invisible script. Their responses to questions seemed rehearsed, and they showed no individual personality or opinions that differed from standard collective doctrine. Amanda's analysis of the biological samples revealed something even more disturbing. The crew members from different species showed signs of neural modification that appeared to be artificial rather than natural evolution. Brain scans that the Zephyrians had proudly shared as examples of collective medical care showed clear evidence of deliberate alteration to specific regions associated with aggression and independent thinking. The implications of these discoveries hit Jake like a physical blow. The peaceful paradise that the Zephyrians described was built on the forced modification of entire species. The happiness and contentment of collective members came from having their natural instincts and desires surgically removed. They were not allies, but prisoners who had been made to enjoy their captivity. Rick's follow-up investigation using long-range sensors revealed more troubling evidence. Several nearby systems showed signs of recent conflict, followed by the complete disappearance of all military installations and defensive structures. Species that had once been known for their warrior cultures now existed only as peaceful farmers and artists. The pattern was consistent across dozens of worlds. Jake faced the hardest decision of his career as he prepared his report for Earth. Command. The Zephyrians were waiting for humanity's answer to their invitation and had made it clear that they expected a positive response. They spoke of peace, but the evidence suggested that their version of peace came at the cost of everything that made species unique and independent. The communication to Earth took 18 hours to reach the Sol system, and another 18 hours for the reply to arrive. President Helen Brooks' response was brief and direct. Humanity would not trade freedom for security, regardless of the benefits offered. The answer to the collective's invitation was a firm and final no. When Jake delivered humanity's rejection to Harmony singer Veltar, the Zephyrian's crystalline features showed something that looked like genuine surprise. He had clearly expected a different answer and seemed unable to understand how any species could refuse the gift of eternal peace. His final words before the alien ships departed carried a tone of warning disguised as concern. The galaxy was a dangerous place for species that chose to remain alone. 3 months had passed since humanity rejected the Zephyrian Collective's first offer, and the galaxy was beginning to tremble. Admiral Karen Stone stood in the command center of the battle station Liberty's Edge and watched the long-range sensors track dozens of alien ships moving toward human space. The readings showed vessel types from at least 12 different species, all flying together in formations that spoke of desperate urgency rather than military precision. The reports coming in from across human territory painted a picture that worried even the most optimistic military analysts. Merchant ships reported strange encounters with alien vessels that approached peacefully but seemed to be studying human defenses and technology. Deep space monitoring stations detected massive energy signatures from the direction of collective space, as if entire fleets were being mobilized for the first time in centuries. General Paul Rivers had been promoted to Supreme Military Commander of all human forces after the first contact incident. He spent his days reviewing intelligence reports that grew more disturbing with each passing week. The collective was not just preparing for war, but seemed to be awakening weapons and systems that had been dormant for so long that their own records had forgotten they existed. Dr. Tony Mitchell worked around the clock in his psychology lab, trying to understand the alien mindset that could create such a vast empire of willing slaves. His analysis of the Zephyrian communications revealed patterns of thinking that were fundamentally different from human psychology. The aliens genuinely believed that removing free will was a gift and could not understand why any species would choose the pain of independence over the comfort of submission. The second contact came without warning on a Tuesday morning when Karen's sensors detected a massive fleet dropping out of hyperspace just outside the Sol system's outer boundary. The ships were not positioned for attack, but instead formed a defensive formation that suggested they were more afraid of human response than confident in their own power. The lead vessel transmitted a request for peaceful dialogue that carried undertones of desperation. Karen granted permission for a small delegation to approach Liberty's Edge under heavy escort. The sight that greeted her in the main docking bay was unlike anything from the first contact. Instead of the confident Seafarans who had visited the Aurora, there were representatives from 12 different species, all showing clear signs of distress and exhaustion. The insectoid hive queen Zektha was the most shocking sight of all. Her species had once been known throughout the galaxy as fierce warriors who fought with a savagery that made other races avoid their territory. Now she stood before Karen with tears of metallic silver streaming down her chitinous face as she begged humanity to reconsider their rejection of collective membership. The aquatic Medani delegation had brought artifacts from their homeworld that they claimed were sacred beyond any material value. Their spokesperson explained through a translation device that these items represented thousands of years of their cultural heritage, and they were willing to give them all to humanity if it would prevent the coming war. Each species representative told a similar story of peaceful worlds now living in fear because humanity's defiance had somehow awakened something in their populations. Workers were asking questions they had never thought to ask before. Artists were creating works that challenged collective doctrine. Even children were showing signs of the aggressive and independent behavior that the neural conditioning was supposed to have eliminated forever. Karen listened to each plea with growing understanding of what humanity's rejection had really accomplished. The example of human defiance was spreading like a virus through the collective's carefully controlled population. Species that had been docile for centuries were beginning to remember what they had lost when they accepted Zephyrian peace. Formal negotiation session took place in Liberty's Edge's largest conference room with General Rivers participating via secure communication link from Earth. The alien delegates presented their new offer with a desperation that made their previous confidence seem like ancient history. They promised humanity complete autonomy within collective space, along with access to all their advanced technology and resources. When that offer was rejected, they increased their bid to include entire star systems that humanity could govern without interference. They offered to share weapons technology that could make human ships invincible and medical advances that could eliminate death itself from human experience. Each rejection seemed to drive them deeper into panic as they realized that their empire was beginning to crack. Dr. Mitchell observed the negotiations from behind one-way glass and made notes about the psychological breakdown he was witnessing. The alien representatives were displaying behavior patterns that suggested their neural conditioning was failing under extreme stress. Their carefully programmed responses were giving way to emotions and reactions that seemed more natural and spontaneous. The breakthrough came when one of the younger Medani delegates broke away from his group's prepared statement and spoke directly to Karen in words that carried raw emotion. He said that his people had begun dreaming of oceans they had never seen and wars they had never fought. The dreams were confusing and frightening, but also somehow beautiful in a way that their peaceful existence had never been. General Rivers ended the negotiation with words that would be remembered throughout the galaxy for generations to come. He told the assembled delegates that humanity appreciated their offers, but could not accept peace that was built on the destruction of what made each species unique and valuable. The human answer remained the same simple word that had started this crisis. The alien fleet departed the next day, but not before long-range sensors detected internal communications between the various species that showed cracks in their unified front. Some delegations were arguing with others about the wisdom of continued peaceful approaches, while a few were openly questioning whether the collective's version of peace was worth preserving at any cost. Within a week, reports began arriving from human merchants and explorers operating near collective space. Entire star systems had gone dark, as if their populations had simply vanished overnight. Ancient defense satellites were powering up around worlds that had not seen military activity in over 1,000 years. The collective was preparing for a war they had forgotten how to fight. Karen knew that humanity had crossed a line from which there could be no return. The galaxy's reaction to human defiance had made peaceful coexistence impossible. The choice now was between submission and total war with an enemy that controlled thousands of worlds and billions of beings. Yet as she watched the stars through her command center's main viewport, she felt no regret for the path humanity had chosen. The second rejection had been delivered, and the consequences were already spreading across the galaxy like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. Soon every species would have to choose between the comfortable slavery they had known for centuries and the dangerous freedom that humanity offered by example. The galaxy had forgotten what war truly meant until humanity reminded them with fire and steel. Captain Betty Adams piloted her stealth frigate, Phoenix, through the asteroid field surrounding the collective monitoring station, designated target Alpha by human intelligence. The alien facility had been watching human space for months while transmitting detailed reports back to Zephyrian Command about human military preparations and defensive positions. Betty's orders were simple and direct. Destroy the station and all its occupants without leaving any evidence that humans were responsible. The mission would send a message to the collective that their surveillance operations were not welcome in human territory, while maintaining the fiction that humanity was still open to peaceful resolution of their differences. The Phoenix moved like a shadow through the tumbling rocks and ice chunks that made up the asteroid field. Betty had handpicked her crew from volunteers who understood that this mission would likely start a war that could destroy human civilization. Yet every person aboard the ship had accepted their assignment with enthusiasm that spoke of humanity's eagerness to finally face their alien tormentors in open combat. Lieutenant Commander Bob Taylor monitored the ship's stealth systems from his position at the tactical console. The Phoenix represented the cutting edge of human military technology, with armor that could absorb energy weapons and engines that left no detectable signature in space. The collective had never encountered anything like it because they had forgotten that some species preferred to solve problems with violence rather than negotiation. The monitoring station appeared on their screens as a crystalline structure that seemed to grow directly from the largest asteroid in the field. Its organic curves and bioluminescent panels marked it as typical Zephyrian construction, but the sensor arrays covering its surface were clearly designed for long-range surveillance rather than scientific research. The facility was violating human space without permission, and that made it a legitimate military target. Betty ordered the attack to begin with precision, strikes that disabled the station's communications array before moving on to its power systems and life support. The Phoenix's weapons were designed for stealth operations with energy beams that left no trace of their origin and explosive charges that would look like equipment failures to any investigation. Within minutes, the monitoring station was nothing but glowing debris scattered among the asteroids. Colonel Steve Murphy commanded the Mars Defense Grid when the first collective probe ships arrived in the Sol system 3 days after the Phoenix's successful mission. The alien vessels approached with their weapons powered down and transmitted messages requesting permission to investigate the destruction of their monitoring station. They seemed genuinely confused about what had happened and appeared to expect human cooperation in solving the mystery. Steve's response came in the form of concentrated missile fire from concealed launch platforms scattered throughout the outer planets. The probe ships had expected to find panicked humans begging for mercy or offering explanations for the monitoring station's destruction. Instead, they encountered weapon systems that had been secretly constructed over the past year by soldiers who viewed the coming war as an opportunity to prove human superiority over alien arrogance. The collective probe ships were destroyed before they could transmit any information back to their fleet, but their destruction served humanity's purposes perfectly. The message was clear to anyone with the intelligence to understand it. Human space was closed to collective vessels, and any attempt at intrusion would be met with immediate and overwhelming force. Dr. Carl Brooks worked in his hidden research facility beneath the ice of Europa while the first battles raged in the outer system. His team had been studying captured collective technology for months in an attempt to understand the neural conditioning process that kept entire species enslaved to Cypherian control. The breakthrough came when they discovered that the conditioning could be reversed with the right combination of electromagnetic pulses and chemical treatments. The first test subjects were collective prisoners captured during the monitoring station raid. 3 Madani technicians and 2 insectoid workers from a species called the Vrex had survived the destruction of their facility and been secretly transported to Carl's laboratory for study. The reversal process was dangerous and painful, but the results exceeded every expectation. And Megani, who emerged from the treatment, were nothing like the peaceful creatures that had begged for human submission just months earlier. They retained their memories of life under collective control, but now viewed that existence with horror and disgust that made them eager allies in humanity's war against their former masters. Their natural aggression and warrior instincts had been restored along with the creativity and independent thinking that made them valuable partners rather than mindless servants. Lieutenant Commander Nancy White led a squadron of human fighters through the Titan system when the second wave of collective ships arrived to investigate the destruction of their probe vessels. The alien fleet was larger and better prepared than the first group, but they still moved with the cautious predictability of beings who had forgotten how to think tactically about warfare. Nancy's fighters used maneuvers that defied collective understanding of physics and psychology to attack from angles that should have been impossible. Human pilots flew with a combination of skill and recklessness that the aliens found incomprehensible because their own crews had been conditioned to avoid unnecessary risks even when such caution meant accepting defeat. The battle lasted 6 hours and ended with the complete destruction of the collective fleet without the loss of a single human vessel. Nancy's after-action report noted that the enemy ships seemed to be crewed by beings who had forgotten how to adapt to changing circumstances or think creatively about tactical problems. They followed predetermined attack patterns even when those patterns were clearly failing and seemed incapable of learning from their mistakes during combat. Of human victories spread across the galaxy through communication networks that the collective could not control or monitor. Species that had been enslaved for centuries began experiencing something they had not felt in generations. Hope flickered to life in the hearts of beings who had forgotten they possessed such emotions as reports reached them of humans fighting and winning against impossible odds. The Korthik warrior clans were among the first to respond to the example of human defiance. Their homeworld had been pacified over 800 years earlier, and their population had been reduced to peaceful farmers and artists who showed no interest in their species' violent heritage. But as news of human victories reached them, something stirred in their genetic memory that the collective's conditioning could not suppress. Spontaneous riots broke out in Korthek cities as individuals began attacking collective administrators and destroying the neural conditioning facilities that kept their people docile. The violence spread from world to world as the warrior instincts that had made the Korthek feared throughout the galaxy began to reassert themselves. Despite centuries of artificial suppression, similar uprisings occurred among dozens of other species as the example of human resistance awakened memories and instincts that the collective had believed were permanently erased. The galaxy was remembering how to fight, and the result was chaos that threatened to tear apart an empire that had stood unchallenged for over 1,000 years. The war entered its second year with humanity standing alone against an increasingly desperate collective, but Captain Roy Evans knew they were no longer truly fighting by themselves. His deep reconnaissance ship Ranger moved through the shadow zones between star systems carrying intelligence reports that painted a picture of galactic revolution, spreading faster than anyone had dared to hope. The Korthek uprising had succeeded beyond all expectations with their warrior clans, systematically dismantling every collective installation in their territory with a brutality that impressed even human military observers. The aliens who had once been feared across the galaxy for their savage fighting methods were remembering exactly why other species had learned to avoid their space during the old days before Zephyrian conquest. Roy's mission took him deep into former collective territory, where he documented the collapse of an empire that had seemed unshakable just 2 years earlier. Entire sectors had declared independence from Zephyrian control, while others were locked in civil wars between those who wanted freedom and those who still believed in the peace that neural conditioning had provided. Commander Ashley Turner led the humanitarian missions that followed in the wake of human military victories. Her transport ship Haven carried medical supplies and technical experts to worlds where newly liberated species were struggling to rebuild civilizations that had been dormant for centuries. The work was dangerous because many of these worlds were still contested between collective loyalists and freedom fighters. The Nexari had been among the most tragic cases of collective manipulation. Their proud warrior culture had been reduced to simple agricultural work with their population, scattered across farming colonies that produced food for other collective species. When the neural conditioning began breaking down, the Nexari found themselves remembering technologies and fighting techniques that their ancestors had developed over thousands of years. Ashley worked closely with Nexari leaders who were trying to rebuild their military capabilities while also managing the psychological trauma that came with recovered memories. Many Nexari wept when they realized how much of their heritage had been stolen from them, but that grief quickly transformed into rage that made them fierce allies in the war against their former oppressors. The liberated worlds became beacons of hope for species still under collective control, but they also created new challenges for human commanders who found themselves coordinating military operations across dozens of different cultures and fighting styles. Some species preferred direct assault tactics, while others excelled at stealth and sabotage operations that complemented human strategic thinking. Admiral Frank Morrison had been promoted to overall command of human military operations after his younger brother Jake's exploration vessel was lost during a reconnaissance mission in collective space. Frank carried the burden of family grief, along with the responsibility for humanity's survival, in a war that grew larger and more complex with each passing month. The Zephyrians were learning to adapt their tactics as their empire crumbled around them, but their efforts were hampered by the same neural conditioning they had used to control other species. Their own leadership had been modified to eliminate the aggressive instincts and creative thinking that successful military commanders required. They could follow established procedures, but struggled to develop new strategies when their old methods failed. Dr. Mary Johnson worked from a secure facility on Luna, developing psychological warfare techniques that targeted the fundamental weaknesses in collective thinking. Her broadcasts were transmitted across the galaxy using captured collective communication, networks to reach enslaved populations with messages designed to accelerate the breakdown of their neural conditioning. The broadcasts did not offer peace or negotiation, but instead told enslaved species exactly how they had been manipulated and diminished by their collective masters. Mary's team had studied the conditioning process extensively and knew which specific memories and instincts to target in order to trigger the fastest possible recovery of natural behavior patterns. The psychological warfare campaign achieved results that exceeded every projection as species. After species experienced mass reversions to their original nature, peaceful farming communities became military training camps overnight as recovered. Warriors began teaching their children the fighting techniques that previous generations had been forced to forget. The collective's response to these developments was a series of increasingly desperate peace offers that arrived through diplomatic channels protected by white flag protocols. Each offer was more generous than the last as Zephyrian leaders tried to find some combination of concessions that would convince humanity to end their campaign of galactic liberation. They offered complete technological exchange that would advance human civilization by thousands of years in a single generation. They promised vast reparations in the form of entire star systems, along with the resources needed to colonize and develop them. They even offered to become servants of humanity if that would satisfy human demands for justice. President Helen Brooks received each offer in the Oval Office, surrounded by advisors who represented every aspect of human government and military leadership. The debates were intense because some of the collective offers would solve every material problem that humanity faced while providing security that could last for millennia. But the principle at stake was larger than any practical consideration. And Brooks understood that accepting peace under these circumstances would validate everything the collective had done to create their empire of slaves. Her response to each offer was broadcast across the galaxy so that every species could hear humanity's position stated clearly and without compromise. The message was simple but revolutionary in its implications for galactic politics. Peace that was offered from a position of weakness after being refused when offered from strength was not genuine peace, but merely a temporary pause in hostilities. True peace could only exist between equals who chose cooperation because they valued each other rather than because they feared the consequences of continued conflict. The final peace offer came directly from the collective's ruling council through channels that bypassed all normal diplomatic protocols. The Zephyrians were offering complete surrender, along with guarantees that they would never again interfere with human affairs, or those of any species that chose to align themselves with human leadership. Brooks rejected this offer as well, because it still treated peace as something that could be negotiated rather than something that had to be earned through demonstrated respect for the rights and dignity of other species. The collective had shown their true nature during centuries of enslavement, and no promise or treaty could erase that history. The rejection of the final peace offer marked the end of diplomacy and the beginning of total war, as both sides prepared for battles that would determine whether the galaxy's future belonged to freedom or slavery. The choice had been made, and there would be no turning back from the path that led toward either victory or extinction for both humanity and their growing alliance of liberated worlds. The final battle took place not in the darkness of space, but in the minds of billions of beings across thousands of worlds as Dr. Tony Mitchell's neural restoration technology reached its ultimate deployment. The weapon that had begun as a simple reversal process for individual prisoners had evolved into a galactic transmission system capable of breaking the mental chains that held entire civilizations in bondage. Admiral Betty Adams commanded the assault fleet that approached the collective's central world while the Restoration. Broadcasts flooded subspace communication networks with signals designed to awaken every enslaved mind in Zephyrian territory. Her ships moved through space that had once been the heart of an empire, but now resembled a battlefield with the wreckage of collective vessels drifted among the debris of their shattered authority. The Zephyrian homeworld appeared on the main screen as a crystal palace floating in space with structures that seemed to grow like living coral from the planet's surface. It was beautiful in the way that all collective architecture was beautiful, but Betty could see the defensive systems that protected it were designed more for ceremony than actual warfare. The aliens had forgotten that some problems could not be solved through negotiation and peaceful discussion. The planetary defense grid activated as the human fleet approached, but its weapons fired with the hesitation of beings who had been conditioned to avoid violence, even when their own survival was at stake. Betty's ships responded with coordinated strikes that demonstrated the tactical superiority the humans had maintained throughout the war. The battle was over before it truly began. The surviving Zephyrian leaders requested permission to surrender, and Betty granted their request because human military doctrine included provisions for accepting the capitulation of defeated enemies. The aliens who transported up to her flagship were nothing like the confident beings who had first approached humanity with offers of peaceful integration into their collective. Harmony-Singer Veltar was among the delegation, and Betty recognized him from the intelligence reports about the first contact incident. The crystalline being who had once spoken with such certainty about the benefits of collective membership now trembled with fear as he begged humanity to show mercy to his people and spare them from the vengeance of the species they had enslaved. For centuries, the irony was not lost on Betty that the aliens were now offering humanity the same kind of peace they had once demanded from human negotiators. Complete submission in exchange for protection from the consequences of their actions. The difference was that humanity had the power to enforce their terms, while also having the wisdom to understand that true victory required something more than simple revenge. General Paul Rivers faced the most important decision of his career. As reports arrived from across the galaxy about newly liberated species who were demanding justice for centuries of enslavement and cultural destruction, the Korthik wanted permission to hunt down every Zephyrian in their territory. The Nexari sought to reclaim artifacts and technologies that had been stolen from their homeworlds. Dozens of other civilizations saw the defeat of their former masters as an opportunity for long overdue retribution. The easy choice would have been to step aside and let the liberated species take whatever revenge they felt was appropriate. Forces were stretched thin across the galaxy and could not realistically protect the Zephyrians from every group that wanted to settle old scores. Many human commanders argued that the aliens deserved whatever punishment they received, but Rivers understood that the choice humanity made in this moment would define their role in the galaxy for generations to come. The decision to protect defeated enemies from the anger of their former victims would establish precedents that could either create lasting peace or plant the seeds of future conflicts. The harder path was also the right path. President Helen Brooks announced the establishment of the Terran Protectorate during a broadcast that reached every inhabited world in known space. The surviving Zephyrians would be placed under human protection while also being required to make reparations for the damage their empire had caused. They would never again be permitted to possess the technology or authority needed to enslave other species. The reaction from liberated worlds was mixed with some species expressing anger that humanity was protecting the beings who had destroyed their civilizations. But most of the newly free peoples eventually came to understand the wisdom of human restraint and the long-term benefits of establishing justice through law rather than revenge through violence. The Zephyrians themselves struggled to adapt to their new circumstances as former rulers who had become refugees, dependent on human protection for their survival. Many of them experienced psychological breakdowns as their own neural conditioning failed under the stress of defeat, and they began to remember emotions and desires that had been suppressed for millennia. Commander Ashley Turner led the rehabilitation, efforts that helped both former slaves and former masters adapt to a galaxy where freedom was protected by strength rather than eliminated through manipulation. The work required patience and understanding because many beings on both sides of the conflict had forgotten how to live without the artificial peace that neural conditioning had provided, the new Galactic Confederation that emerged from the ashes of the collective was based on principles that humanity had learned through their own difficult history of wars and struggles for independence. Each species retained the right to govern itself according to its own values, while also accepting responsibility for protecting the freedom of others. The former slave worlds became proud partners in this new alliance, with many of them developing military capabilities that rivaled human technology. The Korthik proved to be natural allies, whose warrior culture complemented human strategic thinking. The Nexari contributed artistic and philosophical traditions that enriched the cultural diversity of the Confederation. Even the defeated Zephyrians eventually found their place in the new order through a process of genuine redemption that took decades to complete. As their neural conditioning broke down completely, they began to remember what their species had been like before they created the technology that turned them into galactic tyrants. Some of them chose to dedicate their lives to helping other species recover from the damage that collective policies had caused. The galaxy learned hard lessons about the price of peace, imposed through force, and the difference between unity, achieved through conquest, and cooperation, built on mutual respect. Under human leadership, the new Confederation grew stronger with each passing year, as more species chose freedom over security and independence over submission. Humanity had rejected every offer of peace when peace meant surrender, and in doing so had given the galaxy something far more valuable than the artificial harmony that the collective had provided. They had restored the right of every species to determine its own destiny and fight for its own beliefs. The stars belonged to those who were strong enough to keep them free and wise enough to share that freedom with others who proved themselves worthy of it.